We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build the decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast.
Hey there, Elisa Wood here from Energy Changemakers. So if you want to make folks walk away from you at a party, start talking about state public utility commissions. Most people don't know what they are, and they don't really want to know. But they do want their electric power bills to be lower. And that's what these state commissions are all about. They regulate electricity rates. Their work is becoming even more important now that our economy is increasingly electrifying. We're swapping out other forms of energy for electricity for use in transportation, buildings, and industry. So what these commissions do has profound effect on our economic well-being. But the work of public utility commissions is also opaque. It's hard to understand what they do. It's hard to participate in their proceedings. They speak energy. They speak legalese. If you've spent much time around public utility commissions, you know it's an insider's game. Realizing how little most people know about these commissions and how important they are, Charles Hua started a new organization last fall called PowerLines, a nonprofit that is pushing for a utility regulatory system that can better serve American consumers. Charles is the founder and executive director of PowerLines, and he's with us today to talk about a new consumer survey the organization has released that finds utility bills are a widespread and, interestingly, bipartisan source of financial stress in the U.S. Here's just a few findings from the survey. 4 in 5 Americans say they feel powerless over how much they are charged for their utility bills. 3 in 4 Americans are concerned about electricity and gas utility bills rising this year. Nearly half of all Americans say that rising electricity and gas utility bills for consumers like them is a bad sign for the economy. And last, these results were consistent across political parties. 74% of Democrats, 71% of Republicans, and 74% of independents all reported concern over rising utility bills. You can read more about this survey on Energy Changemakers. But first, listen to what Charles has to say about why PowerLines is needed, what it hopes to achieve, and what these survey results mean. Okay, here we go. So, hello, Charles. It is so great to have you here today. I have wanted to talk to you for a long time. I'm really excited about your organization, PowerLines. I'd love for you to start today by just talking about the history here. You started PowerLines back in, I think, September or around that time. And I'd love to know why you did this and what your motivation was and what you hope it will achieve.
Well, first off, thanks so much for having us on. Really big fan of the work that you do. Prior to starting PowerLines, I had spent time in the energy policy space, broadly speaking. I'd done a stint at the Department of Energy working on the grid modernization strategy and have also worked at Berkeley National Lab as a research affiliate. And one of the issues that kept on coming up in the work that I was doing with other folks is this idea that we have a utility regulatory framework that was set up over 100 years ago that is in some ways, in many ways, standing in the way of our broader objectives of lowering utility bills while growing the economy. That is how we see our mandate and work with PowerLines, which is a national nonprofit organization. We're focused on consumer education around the utility regulators that ultimately determine things like how much people pay for electricity and gas, what types of investments their utility companies make, and where certain energy projects are located. So for the folks listening, of course, that is the state public utility commissions or public service commissions. Every state calls it something a little bit different, but broadly speaking, there are 200 public utility commissioners across the country in all 50 states that oversee collectively more than $200 billion a year in utility spending. That's $1 billion a commissioner. And we like to say that these are the Supreme Court justices of energy. And from our point of view, it's an apt analogy because they are the refs that ultimately determine decisions of critical importance, like when a utility wants to increase rates, how much it can do so. And so for me, I kept on coming into this institution, this body that had so much power and influence, yet very few people, even in the energy space, from my point of view, were sort of interrogating whether the system that we have set up works in the current paradigm and how it can be further improved and strengthened and modernized. And so that's ultimately what led us to start PowerLines, is this recognition that consumers are critical to a well-functioning utility regulatory system. And on a going forward basis, it's critical that they're central to regulatory decision-making moving forward.
It's interesting because after you started this, my first thought was, why didn't anybody think of this before? This has been sort of the big elephant in the room. It's what everybody talks about all the time, that there are these commissions. They make very important decisions. Very few people follow what they're doing. And even those who sometimes try, it's hard. I mean, if you're not an insider on the inside, you don't know what is going on. I mean, you can be somebody who understands the power industry generally or understands it in Massachusetts, but then you go over to, I don't know, Illinois or Texas or some other place, and it's different language, it's different approaches, it's the sites. They've gotten better. I've been covering PUCs, since 1989. And, we used to have to deal with paper. But even after paper, a lot of the websites were very poor. It was very hard to find things. It's gotten better, but it's still not great. If you don't have a docket number, you're in trouble, that kind of thing. So I want to say kudos to you for doing this. You saw a need that everybody saw, but you actually did something about it. So it's very exciting.
Well, thank you for that glowing endorsement. I just maybe to comment on that real quick, I think that's in many ways the crux of the problem that we're trying to tackle, which is that fundamentally there is arguably no institution or government body, let's say, that has as much direct impact on consumers' pocketbooks across any issue, not just energy, but energy, healthcare, food, et cetera, than a public utility commission, because they literally have that one-to-one impact on people's utility bills. And I think that's the crux of what we're trying to do with PowerLines, is that because these institutions have such a direct impact on people's pocketbooks, yet at the same time, very few people, particularly residential consumers, ultimately have heard of a public utilities commission, let alone know that it's a space where they can show up and provide public comment. There's a fundamental mismatch there that we feel like there's an opportunity to make sure that consumers actually feel empowered to participate in this process.
Before I get into the survey, let me ask you, what does it take to get a consumer to feel empowered in this kind of arcane process?
It's a great question. So maybe to tackle that, let's first walk through the different hoops that a consumer might have to jump through if they want to engage in the current utility regulatory system. So first off, they've got to have heard of a public utilities commission. Once they hear about it, then maybe over time they will understand that that is the body that ultimately determines their utility bills and sets their electricity and gas rates. So let's say they do have that information. Well, then they've got to go on the website and know when the next meetings are, which, as you pointed out, some of these websites, you've been in the industry for a couple decades now. It looks like some of them maybe haven't changed since the start of your career working in that space. Mm-hmm. And especially for those websites, it's really hard to expect that a consumer, somebody who maybe is working 3 jobs because they can't pay their utility bills, to go on the website and understand, when the next meeting is. And not all meetings are open to the public, so they have to understand which ones are. And then let's say they find out that it's Tuesday at 10 a.m. exactly when they have to go to work. Well, then they can't participate. Or maybe, let's say randomly, they are able to Well, then they show up and maybe they only have 3 minutes to provide public comment on very technical, complicated matters like what new tariff structures should exist for large customers or large loads and how that impacts residential customers like themselves, or rate design, or certain grid planning reforms. It's a lot for a consumer to actually understand what's going on and provide comment that then the Public Utilities Commission feels like they can incorporate into the active record because it's technically grounded and relevant to the proceeding at hand. But even if, let's say, all of that occurs, not every state actually either requires or allows a Public Utilities Commission to formally embed that in the record. There might be some statutory requirements that prevent incorporation or consideration of those comments unless they're formally intervening in the Public Utilities Commission process. And to become an intervener, you might need to expend significant resources financially or legally or otherwise just to be able to show up and provide expert testimony. So as you can just see by illustrating that, call it life cycle of engagement, it is really hard to expect that, somebody who's really hurting in terms of skyrocketing utility bills will actually be able to meaningfully participate. And so there's all these procedural barriers to consumers from participating. And that's why a lot of states have statutory entities, consumer advocacy offices that have been doing an incredible job, the best job they possibly could, given the resources that they have, to show up, formally intervene on behalf of residential consumers. Because the complexity of challenges facing both the public utilities commissions, the utilities, and the consumer advocates is becoming so staggeringly complex and intense, I think from our point of view, we need to see, and we want to see, even further consumer engagement going forward.
So how do we do that? The consumer advocate offices are great, as you said, but they're not funded nearly to the degree of some of these big utilities. I mean, the big utilities are coming in with experts and lawyers and a whole kind of firepower that a public advocate doesn't have. So what's the answer there? Is it to strengthen the public advocate's office, or is there something else that needs to be done?
I don't know if it's any one singular thing. I think it's a portfolio of many solutions. I think what we would say with PowerLines is that, hey, look, we need to examine the regulatory system as a whole and holistically and understand in which ways is it working well, in which ways is it not working well, and how do we do more of the good stuff and do less of the bad stuff. And there are different measures that certain states can take. So, for instance, some states can increase investment in their consumer advocate offices or public utility commissions. And I think it's important to recognize for those situations that an investment is actually what it is. It's an investment. It can actually generate returns through lower utility bills if done right. So, a lot of consumer offices quantify the impact that they've had by illustrating how many billions of dollars in customer utility bill savings they've racked up over the years. But a lot of people, including policymakers, maybe can further grasp just how valuable these bodies are for protecting the consumer interest, but that they are definitely under-resourced relative to the scope and magnitude of challenges that they face. And so I think that calls for states to invest further. But there's also other mechanisms, like simple things like making sure that the Public Utilities Commission meets in geographically diverse areas across the state and not just in the state capital. It's things like changing the meeting times. Doesn't mean every meeting time, but sometimes having a meeting that's not just during the workday that shuts out and prevents people from engaging. And sometimes public utility commissions have an important convening function where they can bring together different stakeholders to understand different problems around energy affordability or other issues, and then work constructively to figure out a path forward beyond just formal PUC proceedings. There are a lot of solutions that are on the table that, from our point of view, a lot of states can take a look at examining and understanding what's right for them, because there is no one size fits all or even one solution that will work everywhere. But what we want to encourage is for more states to take stock of what is and isn't working and how they can make sure that consumer voices and perspectives and priorities are ultimately central to regulatory decision making.
Yeah. Very good point. So I'm curious, are there particular parts of the country or maybe particular states that you're more concerned about than others?
From our point of view, this is a problem nationally. It hasn't always been this way, where there have been geographic hotspots where there's particular upward pressure on utility bills. But at this point, we're seeing this happen everywhere across different RTOs. For instance, across New England and PJM, which is the Mid-Atlantic region, across the West with wildfire risk, across the Southeast with gas price volatility, across the Midwest with transmission build out. All regions across the country are experiencing this challenge of upward pressure on electricity prices. And from our point of view, this needs to be a national discussion for that reason, because it's not just one state or one region that is suffering these challenges. Across the country, we've seen on average over the US over the last couple of years that electricity prices have increased nearly 30% since 2021. And then since 2019, gas prices have increased approximately 40%. And that's something that's afflicted all types of regions across states, geographically, politically, socially. And we really want to make sure that stakeholders understand that this is now a national issue that needs that level of prioritization.
And it could get worse, correct?
It absolutely could get worse. And it is likely to due to a range of factors. Like, we would point to the fact, if you look at what's actually driving up utility rate increases, a lot of it is on rising transmission and distribution capital expenditures. There's a lot of discussion on the generation piece, whether it's clean energy or fossil fuels. Frankly, when you look at the data, that is somewhat less of an issue than the fact that distribution capital spending is double the rate of inflation. And that is in part due to aging grid infrastructure, due to increased resilience and reliability demands on the grid, including expanding grid infrastructure to service, growing electricity demand. There are a lot of pressures on the system that point towards an upward increase on electric rates and therefore utility bills. And so it is imperative that, especially in this moment going forward, that consumer perspectives are key to the decisions that are being made.
That leads us to this very interesting work that you've done recently. PowerLines released a survey. You took a really good look at what consumers are thinking or not thinking or not understanding about electricity or electricity rates, utility rates. I found it fascinating. I'm interested to hear some of what you feel are the highlights of it, but I just want to point out that there were three things that just really struck me. Three findings. First of all, that folks felt the same across party lines, which you just don't find much anymore. So they felt the same in terms of their answers to these questions on the survey. That people feel powerless about their electricity costs. That is really pertinent to our community at Energy Changemakers, because our folks tend to work in distributed energy, local energy. And one of the key attributes is that it gives folks more control over their energy supply. So I found that interesting, that people actually do feel a sense of that powerlessness when they're taking supply from the utility. And then a third thing, no shock here, but it's just so important. People have little knowledge about public utility commissions. And as you said earlier, they're so key. I mean, you get the bill every month, but people aren't aware of who's looking after that for you. So that's what kind of hit me really when I read your survey. I want to hear more about what you maybe were surprised by or would like to underscore about the findings in the survey. And maybe start by telling us a little bit about why you did the survey and what you were trying to accomplish.
Yeah, so we worked with the nonpartisan polling firm Ipsos to conduct a survey of approximately 2,000 Americans across the country to understand how they are feeling about rising utility bills and how that's impacting their pocketbooks. We wanted to understand, in this particular moment where we have seen this upward pressure on utility bills, how consumers are reacting to that. And what we found is that approximately 3 in 4 Americans are concerned about utility bills rising this year. Approximately 4 in 5, or 80%, feel powerless to do anything about these costs. A significant majority don't understand the charges and costs that are showing up on their utility bills. They aren't particularly familiar with the regulatory body that determines those utility bills. The vast majority of them cannot name the Public Utilities Commission as the specific body that determined their utility bills in a open-ended question that we asked folks. So I wouldn't say that anything was surprising, because all of that certainly resonates with our understanding of both the anecdotal stories that we're hearing across the country around utility bill impacts, but also quantitatively when we see the fact that electricity prices have grown 30% since 21 and gas prices have grown 40% since 2019. So that all honestly checks out. I do think that on a going forward basis, what this information does let us know is that Americans of all political parties, of all backgrounds, of all regions are stressed about this, but they don't know where to go. And I think it's imperative for our institutions, notably public utility commissions, to actually take these concerns seriously, lest we all risk the consequences of a utility regulatory system that consumers don't see themselves in and don't believe will ultimately work for them. That's not necessarily a good situation for anybody involved. And so from our point of view, what we are hoping comes out of this survey is a objective look at how people are relating to these issues that they're feeling the pain and pressure of, and who can take action on what going forward to address these problems.
So it's good to get the information out there first, right? I mean, it's the value of this kind of survey. We kind of suspected a lot of these things, but now you have it quantified. I do want to go back to the fact that the results were the same across party lines. That fascinated me, because so few things are the same across party lines these days. And a lot of things in energy have been incredibly politicized. But when you start talking about electricity rates, everybody's feeling the same. And there's no partisanship. So that kind of leaves this issue open, in my mind, to some really effective change. Because how often is everybody rowing in the same direction?
Right.
But here they are. So it seems like it really opens the door for some change. And I think this is what you're trying to do. Probably the thing that stands in the way is simply that people aren't happy, but they don't know that they can actually do something about it.
That's exactly right. That's fundamentally aligned with what we're seeing in the data across every question. And, we asked questions like, how much do people or whether people agree with the statement that their state regulatory body is adequately protecting their consumer interests. And even a question like that saw bipartisan consistency within a few percentage points. Like, that is directly asking, in a way, is relating to the question of people's perspectives on the effectiveness of government on pocketbook issues. And even that was nonpartisan and bipartisan. And from our point of view, this is something that truly cuts across ideology, region, any, set of factors, is that people want lower utility bills and they want more economic development. And those two objectives absolutely do not have to be in conflict. In fact, if you can spread out power system costs over a wider set of customers, that will bring down electricity rates and therefore utility bills for everybody. But that requires public utility commissions that are really doing their best, and not just their best, but even better than that, to make sure that consumer interests are the ultimate driver. Because if they do that effectively, if they make sure that for any set of capital investments that utilities are making, that there are these broader system benefits, everybody can have their cake and eat it too. And from our point of view, that is what's possible, is lowering utility bills and growing the economy. And that's fundamentally our mission. But it has to be done with a very robust regulatory system that is doing a sufficient and adequate job of protecting consumer interests in decision-making.
I don't know if I looked this deeply into the survey, so I'll ask you this question. Did you look at investor-owned utilities versus, say, electric co-ops? Was there any breakdown there?
That wasn't a focus of the survey. We were looking at utility bills across the board and how people were impacted by those decisions, but we didn't do a breakdown across those utility types.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it would seem like, at least theoretically, that if you were part of an electric co-op, you might feel less powerless because the decision-making comes more from the community or, the co-op members. Or if you're part of a municipal utility, you might feel like you have more say because your city is in control. Theoretically, I'm not sure if it's actually true, but it would be interesting to see at some point if that is, in fact, the case.
It's a good question. And I will just say that even for municipal or co-op utilities, a lot of people don't know that the city council or co-op boards respectively are the folks that, ultimately in a way have the final say. I think there's a consumer education need and opportunity across the board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. And of course, part of this is always an issue involving how we treat electricity or how we think about electricity. It's a problem, but it's also good. Electricity is so easy to use that you don't think about where it comes from or who's doing it or who's controlling it or who's regulating it. You just know you turn on your lights and hey, it comes on every day. So it's kind of an interesting product, I guess, to get people to feel they have to somehow take an active stance on.
It is. And I think this is such a fascinating point, and this is just so exciting to me about this work, is that the utility industry is 5% roughly of the US GDP, but it's the first 5%. They do play a critical function. And we know that very immediately whenever the power goes out, whenever there's a major storm or disaster and there's power outages that impact the rest of the economy at a macro scale and the rest of individuals' livelihoods at a micro scale. I think it's easy to take for granted where our power comes from, and we don't have to think about it because all we care about is when we flip on the light switch, do the lights come on? And when we pay our utility bills at the end of the month, is that a reasonable amount? And I like to describe public utility commissions as the offensive linemen. Also, Supreme Court justices and offensive linemen, as an analogy, is quite robust and expansive. But they're the offensive linemen in the sense that when you watch football, if your team's doing well, it's largely because your offensive lineman is protecting the quarterback and you're not thinking about them. You only think about them when something is broken or doesn't work. And that's something that we see here too, is that we've been able to take for granted the public utility commissioners for a while because the system, while it hasn't worked for everybody, has generally been reasonably stable. But I think that with the increasing intensity, frequency, and depth of challenges facing the grid on a going forward basis, I don't think we can at all take for granted some of the things that we in the regulatory system, broadly speaking, have been able to for so long.
Very good point. So we're coming up on our half hour, and I'd like to ask you before we close off, if there is anything the listeners out there can do to help you in the work you're doing.
Absolutely. So first off, definitely check out our work at powerlines.org. And feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from a wide range of different stakeholders. That's anybody from, if you're just an interested energy consumer, or maybe you're a regulator or a policymaker, or if you're a company, or if you're an investor, if you're a startup, everybody is impacted by and can impact the utility regulatory system. And that's something that we have seen happen in many instances. And so everybody has a key role to play in this, in addressing some of these problems and ensuring that consumer voices are ultimately central, not just for the moral imperative, but also for the practical imperative, which is none of this will work. We will not have a social license to operate a utility regulatory system if we don't figure out this question of managing affordability for energy consumers. So we are really motivated by this problem. And for anybody else that is, please do feel free to reach out. I'm at charles@powerlines.org and would definitely love to connect and hear from you all and see if there are ways to work together.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this great organization and your great work.
And thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.